Thank you for the invitation to be part of Northwords Writers' Festival, and I appreciate being a participant. My name is Jake Ootes, and my book, Umingmak, with the subtitle of Stuart, Hodgson and the Birth of the Modern Arctic, is a story of a rough and tumble union leader from Vancouver, a high school dropout who is commissioned to bring government to the Canadian Arctic. The 1960s and 70s were a time of change for Canada's Northwest Territories. Then one of the world's most isolated areas, the federal government administered the vast Arctic from an inconspicuous little office in Ottawa with an out-of-sight, out-of-mind attitude. The Prime Minister at the time, Lester Pearson, was determined to bring the North out of its isolated and colonial state and into the Canadian mainstream. He recognized that Stuart Hodgson, a former Secretary-Treasurer of the Vancouver Local of the International Woodworkers of America, would be the ideal as the North's commissioner. Indeed, Hodgson proved to be the right man at the right time. In Umingmak, I bring to life the memory of Old Town Yellowknife and some of its characters, like the Caribou Queen, the swinging Swede, the wealthy bum who made tomato soup with a packet of ketchup, and the indigenous rebel who ultimately became a prominent leader in the North. Umingmak contains many stories, such as digging out a runway on the Arctic sea ice to let our aircraft escape in a dramatic and suspenseful takeoff, the arrival in Yellowknife of American Indian movement activists Dennis Banks and Leonard Pelche, who were wanted by the FBI after a standoff at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Hodgson's creation of Project Surname, which eliminated the dehumanizing disc numbers by which the Inuit had previously been identified. It describes the emergence of the NWT Indian Brotherhood and the evolution of the Council of the Northwest Territories into today's Legislative Assembly, as well as the pushback Hodgson received by the members of those organizations. It also describes the birth of the Arctic Winter Games and the intricacies and humorous events surrounding royal visits. On September 18, 1967, Hodgson moved his fledgling staff from Ottawa to Yellowknife, then Canada's newest capital. Offices were in a condemned schoolhouse, with Hodgson in the building's cramped kitchen. Huge problems were dropped into Hodgson's lap. The north of that area lacked adequate housing, healthcare, an economy, transportation, communication, and reliable water services. There were often no roads or phones, as well as language and cultural barriers. Lyle Trimble, member of the Council of the Northwest Territories, the forerunner of the NWT Legislative Assembly, warned Hodgson, "The new administration governs more than Yellowknife. It governs the whole of the Northwest Territories." Hodgson was spurred into action. He flew by bush plane on a 3-week fact-finding mission in the dead of winter to the remote communities of the Eastern Arctic, holding public meetings where people could complain, make requests, and seek solutions to their problems. He found himself tackling the tiniest of details, such as payment of $10 for a bag of polar bear bones requested by the Canadian Wildlife Service, but never paid to the hunter by the federal government. He met the people on their home turf, determined to thoroughly know the North and its people. Over the years, he continued these trips. They were adventures, sometimes mixed with humor, as well as moments of sheer terror and shock, flying in whiteouts and in minus 45-degree temperatures. Hodgson worked endlessly, but Ottawa bureaucrats, who had no concept of the problems to be solved, were a roadblock to his programs. They controlled the money, mandarins reluctant to give up control of the North. But Hodgson built a power base with the Governor General, the Prime Minister, federal cabinet ministers, and royalty, people with influence. He put the Arctic firmly on Canada's map and conscience. Over a 12-year period, he set up a government responsible to the people, run by the people. Charles Lynch of Southern Press wrote, "One of the beautiful things is that the powers in Ottawa never quite knew what was going on or how much it was costing them. If all colonies had been run on Hodgson's principle, colonies would still be in fashion worldwide, robbing the colonizers blind. Umingmak is my first-person account of those times. I was by Hodgson's side as his executive assistant and over time in an increasingly senior role. I knew the man and what drove him. He was larger than life. He was determined, outrageous, and always refused to take "can't be done" for an answer. He stepped on a lot of toes and made enemies along the way. He was determined to help Northerners gain what other people in Canada took for granted: decent houses, healthcare, education. His doggedness and large appearance captured the spirit and support of Northerners, and he became known by his Inuktitut name of Umingmak, muskox. Hodgson was a huge influence and a dominant figure in my life. I was by his side for many years and traveled each year with him to all of the North's communities and outposts. I held a multifaceted role as confidant, troubleshooter, public affairs advisor, gopher, and executive assistant, all of which allowed me to participate in a diverse amount of activity, from smoothing over difficult affairs to organizing royal tours. This is not an academic manuscript, but it does tell a significant historic and political story of a fascinating time. The material for this book was garnered from my personal experiences and research from books, newspapers, and magazines. I started researching and mapping out this story 40 years ago, worked on it for a number of years, then set it aside for several decades. Then 5 years ago, I dusted it off, added to it, deleted sections, rewrote portions, and found an editor agent who helped me bring it to a final draft to submit to a publisher. I have come to be aware and appreciate the gigantic and difficult task it is to write, edit, and publish a book. I dealt with writer's block, frustrations in not being able to progress with the story, insecurity, and questioning myself, although I was convinced of the value and importance of this book. I was often sidetracked by family and business needs, but I persevered with the encouragement of and help of David Holhouse, a fellow journalist, Catherine Pellerin, a former Northerner, who is my editor and agent, and finally Lynn Duncan and Kilmeny Denny, publishers of Tidewater Press. My book is now in print. Working alongside Hodgson and traveling around the NWT was a great adventure of my life. My election to the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly in 1995 and participation in the vote to create Nunavut of the Nunavut Territory was a later adventure. I'm following this introduction by 3 readings. I must preface them with this note. During the period I write about, the Inuit, Inuvialuit, and Dene people were typically referred to as Eskimos and Indians. While these words are now recognized as pejorative, they were commonly used in the North at that time. So I've used the terms that were used during the years this narrative takes place. February 1967, Prime Minister Lester Pearson drew his chair closer to the desk. Your job will be to bring Canada's Arctic into the 20th century. That part of our country has been ignored for too long. Unacceptable. The Northwest Territories forms 1/3 of our country. You will be in charge of one of the largest administrative areas in the world, populated primarily by Eskimos, Indians, and Métis, with little understanding of government. It is a land so vast it is impossible to describe with one of the most daunting of climates on the globe. There are no roads, few airstrips, and telephone service is restricted to a handful of larger centers. So there is no effective way to communicate with the 26,000 people who live in 50 isolated communities spread over 1,300,000 square miles. The Prime Minister looked at Hodgson. Arthur here, Pearson nodded towards Arthur Lang, the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, tells me you're the best man for this job, that you'll stand like a rock that you'll give it your all. I'll give it my all, vowed Hodgson. I'll move the government from Ottawa to the new capital in the north and stay at least 10 years to establish the democratic government envisioned by the Carruthers Commission. But I have to warn you that I know nothing about running a government. That is exactly why I'm appointing you, said Pearson. Lang interjected, Stu, you will have to show results quickly. It's important to the people of the North that this government demonstrates its resolve to bring self-government expediently. The government's interest in affirming its sovereignty over the vast, underpopulated Arctic went unmentioned. Lang continued, we'll announce your appointment next week. The Prime Minister rose from his chair and stepped around the desk. Your undertaking is of historic importance, not only for the Arctic and its people, but for all of Canada. I expect big results and more than the best from you. In return, I will give you my full support. No one else in this country will have the kind of authority you will, not even me. My second reading comes out of a chapter which describes Hodgson's community meeting in Arctic Bay and reads as follows. There was a lot of whispering and knowing smiles when he talked about the way muskoxen work together to protect the weak when danger approaches. Some of the people looked covertly at Hodgson and spoke a few words to each other. Hodgson paused and looked puzzled. The translator said, Muskox, Umingmak, looks like you. Hodgson grinned. An hour after the meeting started, the back door opened, and along with a rush of ice fog, in shuffled a plump, short woman with a wide, toothless smile and tattoos on her face. The crowd fell silent. Atuat, whispered the bay clerk sitting next to me. 81 years old. Hadn't encountered white people before she was 40 or more. They call her grandmother. Hunted until she was well into her 70s, and once killed a polar bear using nothing but a spear. People treat her like the queen. With the help of a cane, the grand old lady walked past the audience. She was maybe 4 feet, 10 inches tall and hunched over from age. Her skin was wrinkled, but her hair was still dark and her eyes clear. Born in the late 1800s, she had fully experienced all the harshness of a nomadic Arctic existence. Atuat plunked herself down on the floor in the open space before the seats and stared up at Hodgson, giving him a big gap-toothed smile. Hodgson walked from behind the table and extended his hand. She took it for a brief moment and said something in Eskimo before she let Hodgson return to his place. Hodgson threw the meeting open to questions, and there were plenty. The meeting continued for another hour. Then, after about 2 minutes of silence, he asked, Are there any more questions before we close this meeting? Atuat motioned, and someone darted forward to help her to her feet. She leaned on her stick and looked at Hodgson as she spoke. She spoke slowly, thoughtfully, melodiously. Sometimes, when I thought she was finished, she was just considering her next words. Hodgson listened as if he planned to spend the next 2 weeks in Arctic Bay. The translator spoke. 10 years ago, I lived in a snow house in winter and a tent in summer. It was the old way, but it was a difficult way to live. Now we have houses and we enjoy living in them much more. We are warm and dry all the time. You promised to do many things for our community. For that, we are grateful. We are grateful that you want to help. Hodgson nodded, waiting for her to speak again. I have one request. Could you build a community bathhouse for us in Arctic Bay? I had a bath once, and I'd be happy if I could have one more before I die. Hodgson looked at her with a smile. I will arrange to have materials shipped up on the summer sea lift, and people in the community will build the bathhouse this fall. And when it's built, I want you to be the first one to use it. And next year, when I come back, I also want to use it. Smiles of appreciation filled the room. Atawat beamed and walked to the table where she extended her hand to Hodgson. Hodgson bent down and hugged her. To the delight of others, they behaved like lifelong friends. My third reading is from the chapter called Digging Out. This is what occurred after we flew into the North Camp at Sanakilawak. A landing spot had not been marked off, but our pilot, Darrell Brown, had been assured that it was safe to land in front of the community on the snow and sea ice. Well, we did manage to land, but our wheels were stuck in at least 18 inches of snow on top of the sea ice, and a storm was fast approaching. This is what followed. By now, the local people had reached us and began shaking hands. We recognized some of them from the meeting last night. "We left South Camp on our snowmobiles last night," said one. "We enjoyed the meeting so much, we decided we'd like another one." "Well," chortled Hodgson, "we've got a problem and we need your help. I'm afraid we can't have a meeting, but I'll make sure I come and see you again soon. In the meantime, we have to dig a runway and finish it today. If every man here will help, I'll pay $200 to your co-op. Can you bring shovels?" The Eskimo people glanced at each other, then left to find shovels. The shovels arrived and we all bent to the task while Brown began marking out a runway. Heaving snow to the side of the runway soon had me sweating, and after half an hour, we'd advanced only by a few feet. "Jake," Hodgson yelled, "bring everyone here." When we were all gathered, he said, "We've got to speed this up. At this rate, we'll be here 10 days. He looked at the locals. "Instead of paying $200 to your co-op, I'm going to pay $20 to every man here, if you can find a way to get this job finished faster." There were animated gestures, muttering and conversations in Eskimo, and then they headed back to the settlement. Hodgson turned his back and started heaving snow away from the aircraft. "He's insulted them," I muttered to myself. After a few minutes, the Eskimos returned, cheerfully brandishing big, broad knives and carpenter saws. They set to work. "You should have told us to get saws in the first place," said one. "We thought it was odd when we were told to bring shovels." They ripped into the packed snow with the knives and saws, outlining blocks and lugging them to the edge of the strip. We all joined in, this time letting the Eskimos lead the way, while we heaved and strained and sweated and worked furiously. They worked at a measured, practiced pace. "Work slower, be patient, and you can work all day," one of them advised. "Work fast like you do, you'll be tired in no time." After 2 hours, the runway grew noticeably. The sides piled high with blocks of snow, creating a gully. We worked for what seemed like hours, lifting blocks to the side and shoveling loose snow behind the party of snow carvers. By late afternoon, we were ready to load the aircraft and prepare for takeoff. Brown contemplated the 2 feet of clearance beside each propeller. 500 feet, about a third of what we're supposed to have. We'll have to get up to speed fast. I can't steer until we reach 40 miles an hour, and that will be a problem with these sidewalls. We have to hit 64 miles an hour. That's the minimum for takeoff, but there's no wind right now to give us lift. Tell you what, if we build a ramp at the end so it sets the tail down when we hit, it will help us get airborne. The horizon billowed blacker than before, while the sky above us was drained of all color by the onset of dusk. "Come on, Darrell," I muttered, stamping my feet back and forth, anxious to begin our escape. Cold sweat ran under my armpits. I noticed the others were anxious as well. "Okay, let's go," barked Brown. He was about to climb aboard when he halted. "Oops, nearly forgot." He walked to the front of the aircraft and reverently dropped it to his knees in front of the nose wheel. He raised his eyes and hands in prayer, his bald head, full-blown beard, and wolfskin parka making him look like some possessed monk. We were annoyed by his mockery, but it was a great photo, so I grabbed my camera. There he was, on his knees in front of the aircraft, his eyes closed, with his fingers clenched around each other, shaking in concentration as he held them in front of his face. His lips were muttering words I couldn't discern, but he was serious. Darrell Brown, whose language was as rough and coarse as a lumberjack, now prayed in front of the plane, in front of his passengers and a community of Eskimo people. Maybe we are in real danger, I thought. Maybe we're not going to make it. Well, my reading must end here, but there was way more adventure in this story, and we obviously made it. I hope you enjoyed these 3 readings, and thank you for allowing me to participate in Northwords Writers Festival.